On October 1, 1949, a thin man in a gray tunic stood atop Tiananmen Gate, overlooking a sea of red flags and exhausted faces. His name was Mao Zedong. Behind him lay a century of collapse, foreign occupation, and national humiliation that had reduced the world's oldest continuous civilization to one of its poorest nations. China's GDP per capita was lower than sub-Saharan Africa. Life expectancy hovered around 35 years. The country controlled less of the global economy than Belgium. And yet, within 70 years, this broken nation would become the world's second-largest economy. A manufacturing superpower, a creditor to empires that had once carved it into spheres of influence. But here's what nobody explains. China didn't rise once. It rose 3 separate times, 3 distinct economic resurrections, each triggered by catastrophic collapse. And between each rise sat devastation so complete that experts declared recovery impossible. The first rise from 1949 to 1958, when a peasant army built factories from ruins. The second rise from 1978 to 1989, when farmers became the richest people in China overnight. The third rise from 2001 to 2008, when China transformed into the world's factory and buried the West in debt. This is not the story of steady progress. This is the story of how a civilization learned to resurrect itself again and again and again. To understand how this happened, we must examine something most historians ignore: the economic forces that turned collapse into advantage. Why this moment matters. China's triple resurrection reveals a pattern that shatters everything we think we know about economic development. The standard story goes like this. Nations develop through gradual, steady growth. Stability breeds prosperity. Chaos destroys economies permanently. It was not gradual, it was explosive. It was not stable, it was catastrophic. And it was not permanent, it was cyclical. 3 key players shaped this story. First, the Communist Party of China, which controlled every economic lever but faced a problem. It had no idea how to use them. Second, China's peasant population, 80% of the nation, who possessed nothing but became the engine of each recovery. Third, the Western powers and Soviet Union, who initially dismissed China as too broken to matter, then realized too late they'd created their own replacement. What was at stake? The global economic order that had existed since 1800. For 150 years, the West and its allies controlled world trade, technology, and capital. China's rise would redistribute all 3. But it didn't happen smoothly. It happened in violent economic jolts that terrified even those orchestrating them. To understand how catastrophe became advantage, we must examine the economic forces at work, starting with the first resurrection. Round 1. The Soviet Gamble, 1949 to 1961. When Mao declared the People's Republic in 1949, China's economy was smaller than Italy's. 90% of the population worked in agriculture using methods unchanged since the Ming Dynasty. There were virtually no paved roads, no modern factories. Inflation ran at 1,000% annually. The Communist Party faced a simple problem. How do you industrialize a nation with no industry? Their solution was called the First 5-Year Plan, launched in 1953. The strategy was elegant. China would borrow Soviet expertise, Soviet engineers, and Soviet blueprints to build an industrial base from nothing. The USSR would supply 156 complete industrial projects: steel mills, chemical plants, machine factories. China would pay with agricultural exports and mineral resources. For 4 years, it worked brilliantly. Between 1953 and 1957, China's GDP grew 6% annually. Industrial output doubled. New factories appeared in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. Steel production increased from 1 million tons to 5 million tons. Urban workers flooded into new industrial cities. For the first time in a century, China was building, not collapsing. But there was a problem. The problem had a name: dependency. Every blueprint came from Moscow. Every engineer spoke Russian. Every machine required Soviet spare parts. China was industrializing, but it was industrializing as a Soviet satellite. Mao looked at Eastern Europe, puppet states dancing to Moscow's tune, and realized China was becoming the same thing. In 1958, Mao made a decision that would kill 30 million people. Instead of slow Soviet-advised growth, China would achieve instant industrialization through sheer willpower. The program was called the Great Leap Forward. Peasants would smelt steel in backyard furnaces. Communes would outproduce capitalist farms. China would surpass Britain's steel production in 15 years. The economy collapsed within 2 years. Backyard furnaces produced useless pig iron. Peasants abandoned rice fields to make worthless metal. Agricultural output plummeted 30%. Between 1959 and 1961, somewhere between 15 and 45 million Chinese died of starvation. It was the largest famine in human history. China's GDP growth, which had averaged 6% for a decade, turned negative. By 1961, China's industrial production had fallen back to 1952 levels. A decade of progress erased. First resurrection complete. First collapse catastrophic. Round 2, the peasant miracle, 1978 to 1989. For 17 years after the Great Leap Forward, China staggered. Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, which destroyed what remained of the educated class. Red Guards ransacked universities. Engineers were sent to pig farms for re-education. The economy grew, but barely. 2 to 3% per year, less than population growth. Then, in 1976, Mao died. A small man with a thick Sichuanese accent named Deng Xiaoping took control in 1978. He faced the same problem as Mao in 1949, a broken economy, a devastated people, and a communist party that had lost all credibility. But Deng tried something radical. Instead of imposing a plan from Beijing, Deng's government conducted an experiment in a village called Xiaogang. 18 farmers signed a secret contract. They would divide communal land among their families. Each family would keep what it produced after paying a quota to the state. If caught, the village leaders would be executed. It was capitalism in a communist country on penalty of death. Within 1 year, Xiaogang's harvest increased 600%. News spread. Other villages demanded the same system. By 1980, provincial governments were quietly authorizing what Beijing officially forbade. By 1984, Deng gave up and legalized it. The household responsibility system, the formal name for let peasants keep their food, spread across rural China. The results were staggering. Between 1978 and 1985, agricultural output increased 61%. Rural income tripled. For the first time since 1949, Chinese peasants could become wealthy. Markets reappeared in cities. Private businesses, illegal just 5 years earlier, proliferated. GDP growth accelerated to 10% annually. China was rising again. But there was a problem. The problem was inequality. Coastal provinces with access to trade grew rich. Interior provinces stayed poor. Urban workers watched peasants get wealthy while they earned fixed state wages. Students saw factory managers buying cars while professors lived in dormitories. By 1989, inflation hit 18%. Corruption exploded as officials sold state assets to their relatives. In May 1989, hundreds of thousands of students occupied Tiananmen Square, demanding democratic reforms and economic justice. On June 4th, the People's Liberation Army cleared the square with tanks. The massacre killed hundreds, possibly thousands. Western governments imposed sanctions. Foreign investment froze. China's GDP growth crashed from 11% in 1988 to 4% in 1989 to 3.9% in 1990. The World Bank predicted China would never recover international legitimacy. Second resurrection, complete. Second collapse, international isolation. Round 3, the global factory, 2001 to 2008. For a decade after Tiananmen, China grew quietly. Deng restarted reforms in 1992. Special economic zones in coastal cities attracted Taiwanese and Hong Kong investors. GDP grew 10 to 14% annually through the 1990s. But China remained a regional power, not a global one. It controlled 3% of world trade. Its banks were technically insolvent. Western economists called it the coming collapse of China. Then, on December 11, 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. This was the third gamble and the most consequential. WTO membership meant China accepted international trade rules in exchange for guaranteed market access. Chinese factories could export to America, Europe, and Japan without tariffs or quotas. Western companies could build factories in China without restriction. It seemed like a fair deal. It was not a fair deal. It was a wealth transfer mechanism. Here's what happened. Western corporations looked at China and saw 1.3 billion consumers. They saw cheap labor, factory workers earning $100 per month versus $2,000 in America. They saw no environmental regulations, no labor unions, no strikes. They moved their factories from Michigan to Guangdong, from Ohio to Shenzhen, from entire regions of the industrial West to China's coast. China's exports exploded from $266 billion in 2001 to $1.4 trillion in 2008, a 426% increase in 7 years. Manufacturing employment in China grew by 50 million workers. The country accumulated $2 trillion in foreign currency reserves. GDP growth averaged 11% annually. But here's what nobody noticed at the time. China wasn't just making products. It was absorbing technology. Every Western company that built a Chinese factory had to partner with a Chinese firm and share blueprints. The official term was joint venture. The practical term was technology transfer. Slowly, methodically, Chinese firms learned to make everything the West made: high-speed trains, computer chips, solar panels, telecommunications equipment. By 2008, China had become the world's factory and the West's banker. Chinese treasury holdings financed America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Chinese manufactured goods kept Western inflation low. Chinese growth prevented the 2008 financial crisis from becoming a second Great Depression. The tragic irony was this. The West had spent 150 years trying to open China's markets. The Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, the Century of Humiliation, all designed to force China into the global economy on Western terms. In 2001, China finally joined on China's terms. Third resurrection, complete. Third transformation, irreversible. What happened next? The immediate consequence appeared in 2010. China surpassed Japan as the world's second-largest economy. By 2014, using purchasing power parity, China overtook the United States as the world's largest economy. By 2020, China controlled 28% of global manufacturing, more than America, Japan, and Germany combined. But the long-term consequences run deeper. China's triple resurrection proves something that contradicts Western economic theory. Catastrophic collapse can be economically advantageous if you control what rises from the ruins. Each Chinese crisis destroyed existing structures: Soviet dependency, communist agriculture, regional industry. Each crisis forced reinvention under centralized control. What looked like chaos was actually creative destruction at national scale. The pattern teaches us that economic resurrections require three elements. First, a shock severe enough to discredit existing systems. China's famines, Tiananmen massacre, and isolation each destroyed the legitimacy of prior approaches. Second, a centralized authority willing to experiment at massive scale without democratic accountability. China tested the household responsibility system on millions of peasants without asking permission. Third, patient capital accumulation during recovery phases. China didn't distribute its wealth, it reinvested it in infrastructure, education, and technology. Today, we see this pattern repeating. When COVID-19 struck in 2020, China's economy contracted for the first time in 40 years. Analysts predicted prolonged decline. Instead, China recovered faster than any major economy, growing 2.3% in 2020, while Western economies contracted 5 to 10%. The fourth resurrection? Perhaps. Or perhaps China has learned to resurrect continuously, adapting rather than collapsing, adjusting rather than failing. This teaches us that the global economic order isn't fixed. It's cyclical. Empires that seem permanent can collapse. Nations that seem broken can resurrect. And economic catastrophe can be the beginning, not the end, of national power. The question is not whether China will stumble again. It will. The question is whether, when it does, it will rise a fourth time, and whether the West, now experiencing its own crisis of debt, inequality, and technological disruption, remembers how to do the same. This concludes the story of China's three resurrections. From a broken nation in 1949 to the world's factory in 2008, from peasant farmers to economic superpower, from collapse to resurrection again and again. It teaches us that economic miracles aren't miracles, they're patterns. Patterns of crisis experimentation and ruthless reinvention. Patterns that repeat when centralized power meets catastrophic need. Today, as Western economies face their own crises, debt loads exceeding 100% of GDP, declining manufacturing, rising inequality, the question becomes, can democracies resurrect themselves the way autocracies can? Or does economic resurrection require the kind of centralized control that democracies cannot and should not wield? Subscribe to this channel if you want to understand how economic patterns from history predict what happens next. Because when the history books are written about this century's economic transformation, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Join 50,000 people who've discovered the economic forces that actually shape history. Subscribe now. We uncover these patterns weekly. This is The Hidden History, and the patterns are repeating right now.